All right, we're down from 3 billionaires to 2 on my panel. So what I thought I'd start with, David, if I can ask you, what makes you happy? I ask this because for most people in the world, the answer to that question would be more money. Now, both you and Bob have enough money for 200 lifetimes, so it must be something else at this point.
Well, nothing can make me happier than being interviewed by Fareed Zakaria. That's an honor in and of itself, so that, number one, is happy. Two, I should point out, if you're Jewish, it's very hard to be happy completely, so I discount my happiness a bit. But, and I should point out that being wealthy doesn't guarantee happiness, as someone famously said. The amount of money that makes I'm sorry? The amount
I think
of
they're
money...
switching to your lavalier.
Sorry?
I think they're switching to your lavalier.
Okay.
Yeah.
The amount of money that it takes to feel financially secure and happy is exactly twice whatever you have. So whatever you have, you're never going to be happy because chasing money is an endless merry-go-round. But to be very serious, in my country, when it was started, Thomas Jefferson wrote a sentence that became the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He never, in the 50 years he lived after he wrote that sentence, defined what happiness was, because for him it was unclear what happiness really was. And there's no doubt that all of you know the most elusive thing in life is personal happiness. Most people go through their life and they have their ups and downs. It's very difficult to go through life being completely and happy all the time. But I think okay, as a general rule, got it? Okay? All right. As a general rule, I think happiness is something that is dependent on one's state of being useful for society and doing something useful, creating a family, that therefore you create heirs that will live after you, doing something that makes other people feel that they have something valuable as well. So the people that I know who are most happy, who are the happiest people, are people that have not created the greatest wealth for themselves. Many times the greatest wealth creators are actually the most tortured souls. The happiest people I've ever met are the people who either have very modest means and have done something to help other people, or people who have a great deal of means but have used it in a way to make their society and humanity better by giving largely all of it away.
Bob, how would you answer that question? What makes you happy, and how do you think about happiness as it relates to wealth?
Sure. The dynamic that David describes, I think, is fair and accurate. You know, many people, to that point, who have achieved wealth are somewhat tortured because I think they haven't determined what is their purpose in a very positive way. You know, there's a great poet, philosopher by the name of Maya Angelou, who talks about happiness in the context of, in our case, the American dream. And Maya talks about a few things, and I'll just read it quickly. You know, what are we in pursuit of? Everyone is in pursuit of a good job. You know, they want to be loved. They want children, and they want healthy children. They want safe streets. They want to count on good health care. They want to worship God on Saturday or Sunday, and a place to party on Saturday night. And to a great extent, you know, that dynamic I found universally to be true. And when I look at myself, my employees, the world that I live in, it's a narrative of happiness comes from fulfillment of self, fulfillment of family, fulfillment of community, of country, and now with this generation, in the way that we've connected each other, it is a fulfillment of a global citizenry, a responsibility that goes and extends beyond the borders of your neighborhood, your town, your country, that says, I am now responsible for people who I will never meet. in the way that I behave, in the way that I engage with the utilization of resources, in the way that I think about creating opportunities to liberate the human spirit. And so to a great extent, when I look at my personal dynamic, it is really about how do I liberate the human spirit? Because it's that creativity that comes from that creates to me the beauty of life and the joy of life. And so I have the good fortune of having created and be a part of a creative dynamic where I have a chance to liberate more human spirits to become their best selves. That brings great fulfillment and happiness, and what I see now is the ripple effect of that is what I see stabilizes not only communities, but enhances the happiness quotient of the people that I have a chance to touch directly and indirectly.
I took two anecdotes. When I was building my firm, I was reasonably happy as it was coming from nothing to something, but I wouldn't say honestly that my mother, I was the only child, ever called me and said, guess what, you just made some more money, guess what, you're wealthier. She would never say, I'm really proud of you because you've made a lot more money. When I started giving away all my money, she actually then called me to say, I'm actually proud of what you're doing. So my point is, if you can please your mother, particularly if she's Jewish, that makes you happy. And I tell all people to do this. I made a mistake. My parents are both deceased, and I did some things when they were alive and some things after they were alive. The easiest thing to do and the most pleasurable thing to do is to honor your parents while they're alive. It's a lot harder after they're gone. So all of you who have achieved something, probably it's because your parents helped you in one way or another. And so when you think about what have you done to honor your parents, if you do something while they're alive, you'll feel personally very happy. A second anecdote I'd like you to think about is this. In the late 1880s, Alfred Nobel was at his breakfast table in Stockholm reading his obituary. It said in the Stockholm newspaper, Alfred Nobel has died. Thank God the merchant of death is gone. The inventor of dynamite is no longer with us. Now, of course, he was with us. He was reading his own obituary. The newspaper had gotten it wrong. It was his brother Ludwig who had died. But he saw what people thought about him. And he said, uh-oh, this is what people think about me. And think about this. If you could read your own obituary tomorrow, would you be happy? If you wouldn't be happy, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
And I tell people, think about what you would do if you could write your own obituary. And if you're not happy about it, do something now before it's too late so that you will be pleased, or at least your heirs will be pleased, with the life that you created.
Let me ask both of you a question about your backgrounds and happiness, because I think it's relevant. There's a beautiful piece in the New York Times, Bob, about this is the 400th anniversary of slavery, the introduction of slavery. And this woman, Nicole Hannah Jones, wrote this beautiful essay in which she had this line, which just resonated so much for me. She said, blacks in America have believed the best of America, even though they have been exposed to the worst. If you think about it, no community has been exposed to the worse than African Americans, and yet they have always held out the promise, held out for the idea that there can be redemption. Why do you think that is? I mean, it would be so easy to get so angry and bitter,
Sure.
given the history.
Sure. The dynamic, of course, started with, a capture of free people who then became enslaved and moved 400 years across the ocean, stripped of their identity, stripped of their culture, stripped of their religion, stripped of their language, and then redefined in a way that in some cases still has an overhang in our country. But African Americans, by and large, have determined that we have made and will continue to make substantial contributions to actually make America live up to its promise. If you think about it, when these words that David talked about, all men created equal, they weren't referring to African Americans. They actually weren't referring to women. So, part of our plight is to help define America in the way that it should be defined, and hopefully, lead the world in the context of a morality, of a way that we should treat each other, in a way that we should lead the world, frankly, in what is the right sort of way as human beings to engage on this planet. we take steps forward, we take steps backwards. But I think it is always, call it the hope and belief and the actions that continue to propel us forward. I look at the systemic and institutional racism that has occurred in our country, and part of it still does occur. But it is up to us and people like me and people like David and others to say, all right, what is it that we're going to do to continue to advance the morality of our country? And those are the things that create the optimism and the hope that help us continue as a community and as a people to move forward. I like to do my part by, living as an upstanding citizen and giving back to the communities in ways in which it uplifts others. And it creates on-ramps for others to actually participate in what is the greatest economic structure, capitalism, in America that this planet has ever seen. It hasn't created, today, there hasn't been a complete opportunity for everyone, and so every chance I have a chance to build these bridges and these on-ramps into that construct is something that I take the leadership in doing, and try to create as many friends who will engage that as well.
David, when I think about the Jewish experience, which you mentioned, I think it's in some ways summarized by Woody Allen when he was asked about his view of life. He said, well, there were these hotels in the Catskills, and you'd go to them for weekends, and I always thought there was such horrible food and such small portions. And that was his view of life. Life was misery and sadness and disappointment, and then it was so short, it was over so quickly. Given that, the Jewish experience has been one of a lot of disappointment and a lot of persecution, being in America, largely free of that, has it changed in your view? Do old habits die hard?
Well, anti-Semitism has been around for several millennia, and I suspect it will be around for quite some time into the future. The United States clearly is the place where I think there is less anti-Semitism other than Israel in any place in the world. But I do think there is some anti-Semitism, and it's on the rise. Anti-Semitic incidents on the rise in the United States and in Europe are really quite alarming. But why is it that African Americans don't spend all their time being bitter about slavery, and why is it that Jews don't spend all their time being bitter about the Holocaust? When I think about it, I think about one of the most poignant statements and episodes in American history when Richard Nixon was resigning from the presidency. And as he was leaving that day to get on the helicopter to go back to California, he made a speech that's very hard to believe that he said it, but he said, when you let your enemies destroy you and you get bitter at them, you really destroy yourself. Now, of course, he actually did have enemies, and he was so upset with them that he destroyed himself. But what he should have said is, I didn't really intend my enemies to destroy me, and I shouldn't have been bitter about it. And the point is, if you get bitter about the enemies you have, you'll never accomplish anything in life. You'll be bitter your entire life and never presumably touch happiness. And on the happiness, and one other point I wanted to add before, most human beings, like most creatures on the face of the earth, decide to, at some point, if they can, reproduce. And why do they do that? Well, there's some inherent sense that reproduction and continuing the species is a good thing. But humans do this in part because they think creating children is a good thing, and raising children is a way to continue the species, but also to give themselves great pleasure. And the choice of having children or not is one obviously people can make on their own, but I do think that it is a complicated thing to do for people who have the kind of backgrounds that we now have. Both of us came from modest backgrounds. When you grow up with not a lot of money, you can more likely achieve happiness in life than if you grow up as the children of people who are very wealthy. And I know so many people I know who grow up in wealthy families do not have the happiness that is often ascribed to them, as they should have because they're from wealthy backgrounds. It's very difficult to grow up in a wealthy family and have all the happiness that you have if you grow up in a modest background. So I actually am glad that I grew up with a family where my father had virtually no money. My children have been in a different situation, and probably happiness is harder for them. And as Jackie Kennedy once said, if you mess up raising your children, nothing else in life matters. So the hardest thing to do in life is raising children, particularly if you come from a wealthy family.
That's a fascinating point, and I want to ask Robert what you think about that.
Sure.
Your children, how do you think about, how do you make them fulfilled, accomplished, and happy.
And it comes back again to a narrative of, the definition of who you are as a human being, who you are in the context of our family. And our family is a family that comes from educators. We come from community-oriented, active people, and say, what is it that we can do to improve the station of all of our community? And, like all things, you can define community however you would like. But in growing up, my community was my immediate neighborhood. My mother, for instance, to point to her, this was a woman who wrote a $50 check to the United Negro College Fund, $25 check, United Negro College Fund, every month for over 50 years. And in that period of time, I was saying, well, Mom, I'm wearing my brother's hand-me-down shoes, and why don't I get to buy a new pair of shoes? She said, son, you have to understand, part of what your obligation is to elevate others in your community. And to the extent they were both teachers, both of my parents were teachers, we didn't have any money to speak of at all. It was kind of paycheck to paycheck. But she said, if you do not give to your community in ways that are meaningful, then you have to question what your meaning is in this world. So with my children, it's the same thing. They have, budgets that they work on, but part of what we do every single year, every Christmas and holiday, I have them come back with a report as to which of the nonprofit organizations they want to support and why. And we vote on it. And we vote on it as a family, and then we do a distribution of the capital in that construct. I want them thinking about that now from, again, my youngest is 3. He's not participating just yet. But my oldest, of course, they have the ability to persuade the others to vote for the nonprofits that make sense to them. So for me, it is having a purpose and driving that purpose in the family that affects the community. Now, each of them, as they grow older, they live in different communities versus the one that I lived in. My father, the eldest of 8, we all lived in the same community. My kids now all live in different communities in terms of school. And so they identify areas where they think they can make a difference, not only in terms of dollars, but their activities. Mm-hmm. And I tell my team at my firm, I said, our greatest benefit to the nonprofit and the philanthropic areas that we see is A, make profits for our investors so we have profits to now distribute in ways that make sense. And B, our organizational capacity. So it isn't the money, it's bringing our organizational capacity to organizations to help them be more effective in the delivery of the capital, the resources, and the impact into those communities. That's what we focus on. Just to use one other anecdote, many of you know I'm the chairman of Carnegie Hall, and through some of our work, we now get to over 650,000 kids a year to teach music education where they no longer had music education because it was pulled out of the schools. We created a very systemic way of doing it in a low cost that we can now expand and scale. So that kind of organizational design and capacity, I think, brings more benefit than necessarily just the dollars that we deliver to those organizations.
Now, that's an important point. Philanthropy is really derived from an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. And so I think you can be a philanthropist while giving your time, your energy, and ideas, which are much more valuable in many ways. Yes, everybody can joke about the fact that money is what people really want, but the most valuable thing you can give is your time. You can always make more money, presumably. You can't make more time. And so I try to encourage people to give their time as well as their money if they have money, but their time, it can be much more valuable. And I am also involved in the performing arts. I chair the Kennedy Center, and there what we try to do is to get young people to get exposed to the performing arts without any cost at all, so they can come for free concerts and free arts education on the theory that if their mind is stimulated as an artist or with arts education, they'll be able to do many other things in life other than just arts.
I'll tell you one thing, Fareed, if I can just add to that point. One of the things that we did at Vista was in David, the leadership you've always provided in your philanthropic giving has been inspiring to our entire industry. And the good news is I'm seeing that sort of ripple effect in the rest of the world of private equity. I'm hearing people saying, hey, based on what we're seeing, what you folks are doing, you personally, what you're doing at Carlyle, at Vista, we were I think one of the first to actually have an Our Communities page for instance, on our website, where every one of our employees can now, when they do some work or activity, they post, here's the organization. Of course, there's the matching dollars, but there's also the time that they need to now devote to building whatever that dynamic is that creates more philanthropic activity in their communities. To me, that is one of the greatest outgrowths of being able to create wealth, and what we've done is to now deliver the capacity into the communities that matter to us, and to reward, quite frankly, our employees for doing so. And that to me is what I'm actually excited about in our industry, that's actually making a difference in the communities in which we serve.
So let me ask along those lines, two of the great capitalists in the world. There is now a movement that is trying to rethink or reformulate the way capitalism operates. As you know, there's a very famous essay by Milton Friedman in the 1970s when he was asked what the social role of corporations should be. And he said the social role of corporations is to maximize the return for their shareholders. In other words, maximize profits, maximize the amount that goes back to shareholders. That is your obligation. You have no obligation to be, to stakeholders, to create a better world. Those are all, vague distractions. The U.S. Business Roundtable, very influential group, has actually tried to redefine that idea and say, no, a corporation has other responsibilities, it has other stakeholders, it has employees, it has suppliers, it has the broader public. How should we think about this? Is this a good idea? What motivates it, David?
Well, Milton Friedman wasn't the first person. He encapsulated those views, but for a long time, corporations in the United States and around the world focused only on shareholders and to some extent executive compensation. But shareholders were the highest priority. In the last, I'd say, 15 or 20 years, well before the Business Roundtable statement, corporations in the United States and around the world have recognized they have obligations to their other constituencies, including employees, customers, and the community in which they operate, and so forth. And therefore, many corporations have been focused on so-called ESG concerns. The Business Roundtable statement is an articulate statement that says we should worry more about things than just shareholders, but it's not the first time that business people have thought about that. In fact, very few corporations today do not have ESG guidelines and don't brag about what they're doing, as they should, perhaps, in this category. So if the Business Roundtable is really, I'd say, capturing what has really been happening in the last 15 or 20 years in major corporations and minor companies around, certainly the Western world.
Yeah, if you look at Friedman's statement, he says, profitable businesses serve the common good. That's really, the statement. If you think about the world that I live in and the world you live in business, we have to have sustainable businesses in order for me to maximize and achieve the profitability for my stakeholders, my shareholders in that construct. If I have not built out infrastructure to develop my people, my employees, we will not be the leaders in the space in that particular company, and so the profit will not be maximized. If we actually create an environment where it's toxic, and it could be, again, toxic pollutants, that will not be sustainable. If the resources that we consume in that area diminish, we will not have the ability to drive the long-term profitability of our businesses. So the way I think about it in our construct in Vista, we're thinking about long-term maximization of economic rent for our shareholders. In order to do that, we have to invest in the building blocks that make them sustainable. They happen to be employees. They happen to be the communities in which those employees work. When I was talking with the president here earlier today, the point is, listen, we can construct and build out the training systems for the citizenry to become part of the tech revolution, this digital economy. But if you don't put the infrastructure in place where they can live comfortably, where they can actually have safe streets, where they have schools, no one will want to stay in that community, which means I'm not going to invest in that community, which means I have to go somewhere else and build that infrastructure. So I think of it more holistically in the world of sustainable business profits as opposed to looking at short-term business profits. That's how the BRT statement speaks to me and why our general policies lead in that direction anyway, and that statement helps guide us how we're going to make decisions going forward.
There is three schools of thought you could say about ESG policies. One is that
Just say for a minute what ESG is.
all right, ESG means environmental, social goodness, and governance. Basically, socially responsible policies. So environmentally safe practices, socially responsible practices, and good governance, ESG. If you have ESG practices, the conventional wisdom was a while ago that your rates of return will go down because you're spending time on things that do not maximize profits. That was the conventional view. Then there was a view that maybe you could do ESG and it will not adversely affect your profits, but it's not going to make them better. Today, I think the conventional wisdom is that if you don't pursue ESG policies, your profits will go down. If you pursue them, they're going to go up, in part because people don't want to do business with people that don't have sound ESG policies, and you can't recruit employees if you have no sound ESG programs. In the United States, employees today, younger people out of colleges and graduate schools, they want to work for an environmentally safe company. They want to work with somebody who has good ESG policies. If you don't have them, you're not going to get the best employees.
Let's talk about that from a gender perspective, because this is critical for us. Again, we talked earlier, there is a war on talent globally. How do you find, train, develop the most talented people to work in the world of enterprise software for us? If you exclude half the population, women from that, where does that leave us for the ability to actually compete long-term with the products and solutions that we build? So it is not only just sound responsible, it is an imperative for us to build systems and infrastructure so that we can have more women into our workforce, train them, develop them so they can actually participate as peer, accelerant peers relative to anyone else in our companies. So it's not just a nice to have. It is an imperative, a business imperative for us to build that infrastructure and break down a lot of the walls that existed in the world of technology for women.
In the beginning of our country, we did have slavery that you referred to before, and actually the slavery went on for more than half of our country's lifetime. It wasn't really ended until 1965, and the Jim Crow laws went on for quite some time afterwards. It's hard to believe that existed for such a long time in a society where there's so many well-educated people. But we didn't allow women the right to vote until really about 100 years ago. And so we didn't have women having the right to vote. And for most of the time in our country's early history, women couldn't even own property if they were married. So we had a lot of flaws in our system. But we had one thing that's quite interesting, and it's hard to understand. We only had, when my country was started, 1776, you could argue, when it was started, we had roughly 3 million people in the country. 500,000 were slaves. And of the remaining 2.5 million people, one and a quarter of them were women. So we had 1 1/4 white Christian males. Out of those 1 1/4 white Christian males, we got George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. We now have 330 million Americans, and we have no George Washington, no Benjamin Franklin, no Alexander Hamilton. Where are these people? Now, my theory is they're in private equity, but I don't really know if that's true.
So since I have the two of you, I have to ask you some substantive questions. Robert, you deal with the world of technology so much. What is the next frontier? Everybody talks about mobile, the cloud. How is technology going to change the lives of people here?
Sure. It's actually, while complex, it's actually quite simple. Something happened from the 1970s, in essence, when there was this development of this thing called a computer. The mainframes went to minis, went to micros, all those sort of things. And for quite some time, computing power was scarce. Okay, it was controlled by large governments, universities, and very large corporations. Well, we are now at a state where computing power is distributed. And once you distributed computing power, the genie is now out of the bottle. So it's really just the function of who gets educated on the ability to utilize that technology to create solutions globally. So what has actually now happened is there is a massive explosion of innovation everywhere on the planet where people have access to computing power, and that's more and more, 70+% now have access to broadband engagement. So once the platforms are there, computing power, then it's just a function of who's actually going to be using that to innovate, to deliver products not only to their internal economies, but export that technology. That has led to, again, a massive explosion of data, which I call the second-order effect of software, which ultimately can be used to develop this next generation of, I'll call it, catalysts for future and progress, which is artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, and machine learning. I get an opportunity to see that globally. And what's amazing to me is there are certain countries that are embracing this opportunity to change the dynamic of their call it their industrial and their economic opportunity, and others are still trying to repress this dynamic. When I look at it, look, Asia, quite frankly, many of those economies are saying we are going to embrace this technology, innovate on it. In some cases, it's driven by state organizations or private corporations that are actually putting massive amounts of development dollars. Now, the next few years, you'll see a lot of those development dollars manifest in products that are used in their countries. Years beyond that, because of the way that innovation works, the more data you have, the more you can innovate on artificial intelligence, the smarter the systems become, the more they become intuitive, they will then start to export solutions. And that's when you're going to see a massive shift of economic wealth on the planet based on the utilization of that data. When I look at the Ukraine, and Victor and I have been talking about this, you have very smart people here. You have to build the infrastructure to train, develop, so that you now have a sustainable system for utilizing that brain power on these computing platforms. That's where the opportunity is, and that's what you're going to see the next 10, 15, 20 years, how it's going to play out. He or she who utilizes the data and that capacity most effectively are going to capture their fair share or more of their fair share of the economic rent globally.
David, your Carlyle is in businesses all over the country, in every industry, and all over the world. It's been 9 years, 10 years since the recession. Are we in for another slowdown economically?
In the United States, we have recessions every 7 years on average since World War II. We're now 10 years plus since the last recession. And I should point out, when you're in a recession or out of recession, the U.S. government never tells you that because the U.S. government doesn't want to be blamed for that. So they outsource it to something called the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's a think tank in Cambridge. They said we landed the last recession in June of 2009. If you were unemployed in June of 2009, you didn't agree the recession was over, but that's when it was technically over. Economists are wonderful, and business people are pretty good too, in telling you why we went into a recession. They are terrible at telling you when the recession is going to happen. I can tell you in my lifetime there will be another recession. I don't know exactly when it will be, but I know there will be a recession. And I should be reminded not to use the R word when I talk publicly because you get in trouble. When I worked in the White House for President Carter, he was running for re-election. And his inflation advisor, Fred Kahn, said we're heading into a recession in 1980, which is the year Carter was running for re-election. Carter called him into the Oval Office and said, Fred, I'm running for re-election. Do not use the R word. It scares voters. And Fred said, well, I have to be honest, Mr. President. He said, well, be honest, but don't use the R word. So from then on, Fred Kahn said, we're heading into a banana. And he used the word banana as a substitute for recession. We will have a banana at some point. The real issue in the United States, to be very serious, is whether you can prop up the economy and keep it going long enough to go past the next presidential election. Clearly, the administration in power, and all elected officials in power, not just the administration, the people in Congress as well, want to push any recession down the road. It's not clear whether they'll be able to do that, but today, based on the data that we have, owning about 200-plus companies in the United States, we do not see a recession or a banana between now and the next election. But things can always change. A war can break out. And again, people are very good at telling you why you went into a recession, but not when it's going to happen.
One of the dynamics, just to dovetail on that we have the opportunity to evaluate is what is the actual productivity that we see in the companies and that our companies serve. You know, we have over 65 companies in our portfolio, over 220 million users of our software, and I do a survey really every year to evaluate what's the productivity of the software for the customers that we serve. Because that productivity, to me, is what's going to drive the earnings on companies that may have slower growth. Our average product still has over a 700% ROI to the customers that we sell. So if there is a slowdown in the underlying growth of our customers, they capture the earnings potential by leveraging and buying more software. So I think some of the masking that has occurred of what is actually occurring in the growth of companies is occurring because they are embracing technology more aggressively, and so it's actually lifting their earnings, even though their top line growth may not be growing as fast. That's a dynamic that I'm not sure, the Bureau of Economic Research actually captures well. I haven't seen anyone actually capture that in a way that gives me some confidence that they really understand that dynamic. The last recession we went through, 06, so call it 08 through late 09, I looked at our average customer, and our customers bought 2 and 3 times more software during that period of time to maintain their earnings or to diminish their earnings decline. So there's a dynamic that is now, since we now have distributed computing, that more people have access to this productivity that they're going to leverage, and it may soften the blow or actually, mask it to a point where you may not realize what's actually occurring.
So the one thing that could affect global growth and global happiness, global well-being, would be a continued and deepening schism between the 2 largest economies in the world. David, I want you to talk about the macro side, and then Bob, I want you to talk about, because there's a key technological dimension to this, which is we are moving to a bifurcated technology world with China worrying about its own supply chain and the U.S. These seem to me the 2 dark clouds on the horizon.
Yep. Well, clearly, when you have 2 big economies, they rarely are great friends. If you go back the last 500 years, it's rarely the case, or almost never the case, where the 2 largest economies in the world at any given time are friends and they cooperate and they have no disputes. In fact, it's almost the opposite case. And in fact, in many times, as Graham Allison has pointed out in his book, Thucydides' Trap, you very often have wars, military wars, between these 2 largest economic powers. I don't think we're going to have a military war between us and China. Right now, there's a focus in the United States on whether there's a trade agreement between the United States and China. I believe there will be one, and I think it will happen before the end of the year. And this is basically what's going to happen, in my view. One, the first part of the agreement will deal with China buying more products from the United States, somewhere between 1.4 and $2 trillion over 6 years. I think they'll probably reach an agreement on that. The second part is dealing with market access to China for American companies, particularly protecting intellectual property. I think they'll reach an agreement on that. The third part is the part that it's stumbled on so far, which is to say the United States would like China to back off its China 2025 policy, where it will use all kinds of government resources to make China a leader in 5G technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, and so forth. The U.S. government has pushed China not to pursue some of those policies. That's where the Chinese government has not wanted to go forward. I do think that it's likely that an agreement on parts 1 and 2 will get done, and parts 3 will probably not get resolved, but be pushed to after the next presidential election. But I think the president recognizes, and most people involved recognize, that if you can get an agreement just on parts 1 and 2, even though there'll be some political opposition to it, that would probably stave off any recession till after the election.
Yeah, from a microeconomics perspective, what we're seeing is massive amounts of investment in China, state-owned enterprises, state-controlled enterprises, private companies, leveraging, again, this distributed computing power. Well, what does that actually mean? When you have 1.3, 1.4 billion people, you are now collecting data, and they've given up the pretense of any privacy around this data. So as you take that data, you ingest that data, and you start to put AI systems on top of it, you're going to be able to innovate for products and solutions across finance, banking, insurance, whatever it might be, healthcare, in ways that other countries and economies cannot compete with, because they don't have that massive data set, nor do they have the people who are focused on it in the way that certain of these Chinese institutions actually are. So in China in particular, just watching the massive amount of investment that's occurring, they are looking to become what I'll call more self-sustaining in their technology platforms, building out infrastructure to, quote-unquote, improve the quality of life in China, but then looking to export that along this whole Belt and Road initiative to create a whole series of consumers of their technology in their sphere of influence.
But what happens if the United States continues with things like the ban on Huawei? China clearly is going to try to create its own self-sufficient...
The computing power is distributed to the point it's just a matter of time before they can create their own independent infrastructure that supports their entire IT development stack.
So
no question about it.
So will we have a world in which we will be telling countries buy only, Ericsson and Nokia, and the Chinese will be telling...
we might. That is a potential outcome of this engagement, and I think it's a dangerous one. I think that, again, this shared economy that we've built for the last 20 and 30. Sure, there's been abuses along the way. There has to be a stop to the abuse of violation of intellectual property. We need the right to actually go into China and build companies and own, have majority ownership in those companies, not just be JV partners. So there has to be some construct in order for us to have a more civil opportunity to capture value across the two countries. But if we end up kind of, one half of the world uses Chinese technology and the other half of the world uses, call it Western technology, I think we're going to be in a bad place, and actually it's going to inhibit growth for everyone.
Just say, my concluding remarks, we're almost out of time, that if you want to achieve personal happiness, it's obviously elusive, but one thing that I think you can do is to think about what you can contribute to your own country. Many people recognize that philanthropy is involved with many different things, but you can be what I call patriotically philanthropic, which is to say, figure out something that helps your country be a better place. And if all of you think about today what you're doing in your lives that could make your own country, whatever country you're from, somewhat better, remind people of the history and the heritage, the good things in their country, do things that can make the country a better place, I think you're more likely to achieve personal happiness than through anything else you're likely to do in the short term.
Bob, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
It tells you something about him. Some of you might know this. He recently gave a commencement speech, a graduation speech at a college where a lot of the students have student loans. And he announced at this college, Morehouse College, that he was going to pay off all the loans of all the students in the audience. Did you, first of all,
Thank you.
But to give you a sense of Bob, we have a mutual friend who's emailed me, said, please don't talk about this because he doesn't want publicity for himself about this. So I said I was going to mention it, but what my question to you really is, do you find that you get the most satisfaction when you do something in it being something personal where you can see and touch the people, or something on a big scale where you can look at the numbers and say to yourself, I changed so much for so many people?
Yeah, it comes back to the earlier narrative. Again, I derive the greatest satisfaction from what I call liberating a human spirit. And when you see these young people who have, frankly, a disproportionate amount of burden in debt relative to the opportunity set that America currently provides them, I know that my actions for that class and for others will actually reverberate in ways at scale. So while there's a personal gift, which is part of it, to each of those 400 plus young men, I know their actions are going to touch 400 times, and exponentially the benefit. It comes down to, at the end of it, what is it that you can personally do? In some cases, it is walk a child home. Okay, who otherwise doesn't feel safe. Reading stories to children who don't have that opportunity. In some cases, it's getting music education or arts education into the psyche of young folks. And in some cases, it's actually alleviating them to now become those teachers because they no longer have a burden of debt that's going to keep them from taking a job that is unfortunately in America, a substandard paying job. So like all things, do what you can when you can, as often as you can, and at the scale that you feel comfortable managing. And that's a philosophy I live with. And fortunately, it brings me great personal satisfaction and happiness.
David Rubenstein, Robert Smith, thank you so much.
Thank you, Fareed.